This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Stanford Seminar on People, Computers, and Design. Next week we're going to have James Landay from the University of Washington talking about his research on World Lab, building a research group that connects folks in Tsinghua with folks in the US at the University of Washington. And this week we have Eric Paulos. I've known Eric a very long time. He and I were lab mates in graduate school, and one of my favorite things about this seminar is that many of the most memorable talks for me are people who weren't simply doing some of the best work in their field, but rather they've figured out some way to create a new research area or a new research direction or a new research aesthetic that really they move forward a whole way of thinking. And Eric's work for me has embodied that for a very long time. He's figured out how to combine real technical skill in robotics with a real interest in the aesthetic experience of robots and other technology. One early research project of Eric's was he developed a system called props, a personal roving presence. And they were blimps and robots where you could be telepresent in some location. And in fact, the first time that a prop was ever demonstrated live in person was in this very seminar series about 15 years ago. And now there are many groups at Mozilla and Microsoft and others who are building similar kind of technologies. And so Eric was really prescient in that. And so now we get to hear about the thing that 15 years from now we'll be saying we first saw here. Eric.
Great, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here at Stanford. I always have so many good memories of all my visits here and a lot of great colleagues that I have huge admiration for. It's also great to be back in the Bay Area. So I was at Carnegie Mellon University for the last few years in the Human Computer Interaction Institute, and now I'm back at UC Berkeley in the Electrical Engineering Computer Science Department, but also part of this BCNM, which is the Berkeley Center for New Media. I'll just briefly say it's this concept around looking at how practitioners from other fields can talk about media and culture and technology, and there's a lot of synergies outside of just computer science, and so I'm really excited to be part of that. This is not a prop. This is my son in his Halloween costume. He wanted to be a robot. This is the problem that if you are a roboticist, you can't be outdone by other people in your neighborhood on the robot costume. Anyway, let me just tell you, hopefully we'll have a little discussion about some things that I think are exciting and compelling, and we'll see where we go from there. I want to say a couple things. One thing is the way that often I work with my colleagues is more on sort of this ethos of problem making rather than problem solving. I like to collage ideas of the familiar with the unexpected, the sort of political with the playful, the activist with the consumer, and the expert with the amateur. And I think you'll see elements of that in some of the work here. But let me just start off with a kind of vision here. Not many people maybe know this particular project. This is Operation Moonwatch. It was started in 1955 by Fred Whipple, who said, let's go out and train people how to observe satellites as they orbit the Earth. And he got essentially amateurs to get together and train to do this. The interesting thing is, this predates the launch of Sputnik itself. So in fact, he was actually sort of thinking ahead and saying, I know what's coming, I know what we should start looking at and training for. And in fact, when Sputnik did launch, it was a huge political event. But in fact, his group, Fred Whipple's group, was pretty much in the best position to start reporting about it and delivering information about tracking it. And I think that a lot of times that's actually what we do in research, right? We sort of have to envision something that doesn't exist yet. But I also like this theme of having everyday citizens be involved in somehow participating and contributing to science in an interesting way. Give you another example here. This is, well, yeah, everyone recognizes, of course. This is Supernova 2008 HA. The thing that's more interesting about it is actually Carolyn Moore. So this is Carolyn Moore. She's a high school student in Warwick, New York. And she's the one that discovered this particular supernova, which has some really interesting, unique properties. Now, it's fair to say that Carolyn has more, probably, telescopes than most people in the room. But you could make the same argument about maybe what kinds of sensing do we have? And certainly our mobile phones do a lot more sensing, and a lot of our electronics, our technologies. And essentially, some of the things that we talk about as sophisticated really rapidly are not. It wasn't that long ago when it was very exotic to have a laser printer at your disposal. So I just want to kind of remind you of that. And one thing I'm very interested in, these participation by essentially expert amateurs. And it's not just in the sensing and the observation, I think it's also in the making. This is a project by Marcus Kaiser that is called Solar Sinter. So this is a 3D printer. It's designed to kind of capitalize on the abundance of energy and raw material. So it takes the sun, it drives the 3D printer, it focuses the light, and it actually sinters the sand, which is in abundance as well. And it allows you to sort of create objects. Here's something printed on the Solar Sinter. So a nice little bowl. It's amazing. This was basically done as an MFA project from the Royal College of Art. And I do want to sort of have some threads of art in here, especially coming from new media. And I think the one thing that I like about bringing in art into the critique, so this is a quote I particularly like, "The work of art is valuable only insofar as it is vibrated by the reflexes of the future." So often we talk about technologists as the one engaging in the future, but artists are interested in these concepts as well. Let me come back to this space theme because it's a nice one to kind of make another point. Here we have the sort of classic vision of putting a person on the moon and returning them safely. And the argument is, of course, humanity sort of celebrated this moment. It was a big achievement, but the people that really were kind of the ground troops, so to speak, are the kind of brave engineers and scientists of the day. Now, I don't know what the new sort of problems might be that we might tackle. It might be things around biology. It might be famine, healthcare, issues about the environment. And all of these, I think, we've heard a lot about them even in the recent presidential debates. But certainly, computer scientists, engineers will play a significant role in these kinds of solutions. But I think we need to also consider the role of these kind of expert amateurs, these people that are essentially helping measure and report and come together to do problem solving. And I think that we can facilitate this with building the tools. And actually here at Stanford, you have some really great faculty and students initiating a lot of this work as well. And I'll talk about this idea of micro-volunteerism in a minute, but let me motivate this a little more because I think most people get this, but this is a nice quote from Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago. She says, "Bureaucrats sometimes do not have the correct information, while citizens and users of resources do." Most of us get this. I know my park. I know my bus. I know my neighborhood. I know you know a lot more about what's going on than what's coming out of, say, city government or even state government, things like that. Now, the interesting thing is that these kinds of problems that we were kind of alluding to before, unlike putting a man on the moon and returning them, so when we're talking about things such as how do we solve healthcare, how do we solve environmental global warming, these are actually a class of problems that are much more difficult to understand. They're typically referred to as wicked problems, which is a sort of classification that Horace Riddle articulated a couple decades ago. And the idea is these are sort of societal level problems. They're often very sort of difficult to solve. They're incomplete. They're difficult to even describe what they are, and they have these kind of odd side effects. And I'm going to talk a little bit how design research can allow us to at least approach them. And that's what I feel a lot of myself and my colleagues do when we try to actually have conversations about various proposed partial solutions and things in this space. And I'll say more about design research in a second, but largely I want to make sure that we are sort of, most of you are familiar because there's the D School here and there's a lot of interaction, at least in HCI, about design. But I'm not talking about designing like industrial design. I'm talking about design in terms of an inquiry focused on producing a contribution of knowledge. Okay? Let's just play a little game here for a second. So let's just pretend we're going to solve street crime. Okay? Okay, here's a solution. Let's disarm the police. Okay, that could possibly solve street crime. We could repeal laws. So we could actually kind of redefine what it means to commit a crime. That kind of also actually solves some part of street crime. We could have some kind of ethical control in place of sort of courts and other systems. We could just shoot criminals. That would obviously be a part of solving this if you wanted to go that direction. We could give things away and disincentivize the entire idea of street crime. And I think all of us have to partially agree that there's a solution in all of these, but they also create a lot of other problems. And these are the kind of wicked problems that are hard to just simply, as an engineering approach, propose a solution, measure a result, and sort of move on. Now, the good news is I think that some of the new things that with design research and some of the HCI approaches and all these interdisciplinary approaches of having other practitioners involved in the debate help people to understand and move some dialogue forward about these kind of wicked problems. And I'll just say this to emphasize again. Often these are words that come up, I think, when you talk about design. I would say these are words that kind of come up more when you talk about design research. I'll just like highlight a couple of them in contrast. So like I said, rather than problem solving, often you're problem making. Often instead of in the service of industry, you're sort of in the service of society. Things around where you might be talking about consumers of what you're making, you might be talking about citizens and some kind of like lifestyle. It's less about commodities and buying, but more about getting people to think. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to be able to offer sort of definition of design, but I do think this is a nice categorization. Design isn't everything we make, but it's also between those things. It's a mix of craft, science, storytelling, propaganda, and philosophy. I think it kind of captures a lot of the nuance of what the sort of scoping can be.
Hey, Eric.
Yes?
So I agree with much of your definition of distinguishing design and design research, but if you had a project that was clearly solving a problem, like the filtered drinking straw in Africa, that might be for society as opposed to for industry. And we would probably still call that design more than design research. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a makes us buy or it makes a man rich that defines design.
Right. I shouldn't come down so strict as if everything's black and white. I'm trying to argue more that often when you start to operate and the things don't feel like they're objects that would be produced in sort of mass or marketed or maybe don't serve a useful purpose beyond a limited kind of framing of people or context, that there's still value in doing it, and that's where the agenda of design research you can leverage it. But it's fair to say there's certainly things that are in the service of society, that was a great example, that are a design sort of object. So I don't want to kind of put things in one bucket or the other.
Well, I'm willing to go with the two buckets. I just think the dividing line goes in a slightly different place.
Okay. Yeah, I think like with all these things, there's more nuance. So, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Is what you're calling design research kind of the same thing as, say, critical design as practice, or are you thinking of it?
Critical design is sort of a part of or a component of design research, I think. I mean, it's sort of one way of operationalizing it, I think. That's kind of how. Great. Okay, good. Yeah, please jump in. I don't mean to sort of, it's good to have a little dialogue going on. So I'll tell you a little bit about some projects, and that we can that'll be a little bit more framing perhaps. So after I left Berkeley and I went off to Intel Research, and I founded this group called Urban Atmospheres that looked at sort of observing public spaces and looking for opportunities for technology to merge on those landscapes. It was sort of a proactive archaeology of urban life in some sense. And I had a lot of kind of wonderful colleagues that I worked with through the years here. And I'm not going to go into all these projects. I just want to paint in broad strokes that some of them are things you might expect, like mobile phones and applications. Others are things that are a little unusual. There's trash cans and park benches and some other kinds of objects and experiences, all designed not to be final products, but designed to prompt you about different engagements and also to critique the culture and milieu that they're sitting in. And that's a big part of what we do. I'll briefly talk about one of them, and this was a project I did with Elizabeth Goodman, and it was looking at familiar strangers. So these are basically people that are familiar to you. It's the person you see every week at the bus stop. It's that kid always riding the skateboard down your street. It's that lady with her dog. They're familiar, but they're strangers. So the thing is, it is actually a real relationship. It's a relationship in which you both mutually agree to ignore each other without any implications of hostility. right? So if you ignore your friend, that actually means something. But society, just the way that it operates, and this has been studied by a lot of sociologists and others, that this is a real relationship. And so we're interested in how does technology change this? And again, I'm not going to go through the whole study. I'm just going to kind of cut to one element that fell out of this, which was looking at the idea of, well, what if you could detect the kinds of people around you and you actually knew where you were with them? For example, you maybe were at coffee shops, so the coffee cups represent people that are nearby that you might have been at a local coffee shop in your neighborhood. Or maybe it's color-coded by how many people are new or how many people are sort of familiar strangers nearby. And it was designed to give you a new map or new lens into the place around you. Now, none of you probably think this is novel at all. This is in a huge list of products that we currently use. I can't possibly list them all now, but certainly we're used to knowing about location and connections to social networks that are nearby, networked, but also kind of physical in space. But the thing that I want to kind of point to is when we were doing this project, I actually was inspired by some work by Stanley Milgram, who's a social psychologist who had looked at this exact same phenomenon decades before. This is a picture from his study outside in the Bronx at a train platform where he studied how people remembered individuals. Similarly, we were also inspired by artists. So one of them was actually Vito Conci, who has an art piece that you're welcome to do yourself. It's to find a stranger in public and follow them until they go into a private place. So this could last a couple of minutes if they get in a taxi cab, or hours if they end up sitting in, say, a crowded theater. I'm not going to guarantee you don't get arrested doing this, but you're welcome to do this performance. The point was that we found ourselves drawing from technologists, sociologists, and also artists. And as Scott alluded to, I also worked with John Caney, my advisor at the time, and we did these floating blimps, and they flew around. This was also inspired, of course, by the Vivarium Project and some of the work that Alan Kay had done. And it was about sort of telepresence and having a remote body and the way these moved around. And I'm not going to talk about this project, but this project was also inspired by some work by an artist, Andy Warhol, who did a project called Silver Clouds. If you happen to go to Pittsburgh, you can actually go in this exhibit and interact with them. But the idea is that there's sort of this connection between art and technology that it got me thinking a little bit more about what this could mean. And it reminded me of a project by a friend, Michael Neymark, who worked on this Aspen movie map project. And the idea was he created this laser video disc, I know it's amazing, that you could actually have a touch screen and you could walk around the city of Aspen. And, you know, I thought, gee, that seems like something else that I know about. And it's not to say that if Michael had never done this, we would have never gotten Google Street View. I'm not making that claim, but I'm saying often artists are dismissed as they're doing something that doesn't really pertain to what the real discussion is with technology and society. And in fact, Michael had it right sort of 30 years before. The interesting thing to note is that Michael's project, which, by the way, looks almost the same here, right? Michael actually got, he was awarded a Golden Fleece Award. So I'm not sure how many people well, Terry and Scott, a couple know. The Golden Fleece Award is an award given out by Congress for the most egregious waste of taxpayer dollars. So they looked at this and said, this is a waste of money, this is ridiculous, we should not be funding anything like this. So I just literally sort of sat around. I was having a little discussion with Golan Levin, who's a colleague of mine, and we were just coming up with some other good ones here. So I think kind of camera-based computing really starts around sort of Myron Kruger, who did some really early work in this, and now we, of course, have Microsoft Connect and iToy. But again, artists sort of initiating some of the early exploration in that space. Jeffrey Shaw's Legible City, and a lot of kind of fitness exercise equipment. ArtCom did something that's very similar to what emerged as sort of Google Earth. Graffiti writer by the Institute for Applied Autonomy. If any of you watched Tour de France a couple years ago, then you saw Nike Chalkbot. Very similar. A good friend and colleague, Ken Goldberg, who did the Telegarden. Looks kind of, there's a lot of Farmville connections here. And I noticed this 20 to 30 year gap, and I think, I don't know if it's just because I'm getting old, I'm noticing these things. But this is just, you can just do this all day. Graffiti Research Lab, And then this really badly named graffiti by Agents of Change, All Natural Coke by Red Bull, okay? Sort of 2 years later. And then Hands from Above, which was a sort of urban project done by Chris O'Shea, which let kind of a video monitor, you could sort of pick people up from the video and do things. So again, the point is also that these people are not even giving credit. So these are just kind of blatant rip-offs. People here might remember sort of context photography that Lars Erik and Maria Hawkinson did, looking at how photography and lomography could play a role in kind of filtering pictures. Looks a lot like Instagram to me. They kind of got it wrong because it should have been a little bit more about sort of the context. And even I pulled, this was the class project from a class that I ran at CMU, Daisy Cam, where some students basically said, what if you had this life logging camera? They got an A, they got $360,000. They said, why didn't we do Kickstarter? I said, it didn't exist then. We weren't really, that wasn't there. So, and then I'll start finish with this example because it's a good one. Twitter, actually, Jack Dorsey says, yeah, I saw Text Mob, which was an art project done by Institute for Applied Autonomy, and said, yeah, that inspired this project. And I think that we need to sort of draw more of a literal connection between, there's artists that are engaged in these kinds of debates. And there was actually C.P. Snow who wrote about this in this book, The Two Cultures, where he literally outlined there's two cultures in our society. He wrote in the 1950s in the UK. And he says the clashing point of two subjects, of two disciplines, two cultures, of two galaxies ought to produce creative chances. And I think that's this challenge that's still with us, right? That there's a missed opportunity that things should happen here. Now, I had a chance for a number of years. I've collaborated with a group, Survival Research Labs, here in the Bay Area. Not so much when I was away at CMU, but this chance to look at a lot of things that I think are relevant now, even with the current research. Things about DIY culture, about reuse, about sort of bringing science and art into some kind of connected fabric. And I'll bring this down for a second, but we could have separate critique of this kind of art, and we can talk about it. But I think some things that are certainly here are, there is a critique of the culture, of the technology, of machines, of control, of chance. There is a sort of dramatic, actually script to these, although it looks very chaotic. There's a narrative to each of these kinds of performances. In some sense, there's also a mandate to release the most amount of energy in the shortest time possible, which is sort of an interesting engineering mandate. But this also, as I mentioned before, I was doing things with telepresence, and it wasn't really part of the official agenda of what I was publishing at IEEE and at CHI, but I was interested in other issues that were also around telepresence, epistemological issues around what's real, who's responsible. So with Mark and other colleagues, we built machines and mechanisms that let people actually fire sort of lethal weapons and give control over to other people. Not because we were trying to be out of control and dangerous, we wanted to actually question where the sort of line should be drawn when people start to actually interact across distances. We were curious about what was even real. It's a project I did with Ken Goldberg and Judith Donath and others to explore at what point would you actually be considered committing a crime over the internet if we let people actually kind of burn and do different kind of damage to currency. Of course, if the currency is real and the experiment's real, then in fact there's some criminal behavior because you can't manipulate and damage US currency. I did some other projects with a group that I started called the Experimental Interaction Unit, where I actually designed this device called an I-bomb, which is actually an electromagnetic pulse device. So questioning, this is all sort of pre-9/11, but can I own this kind of thing? Can I operate this kind of device? A little bit of it was to push back on, we talk about establishing national parks in places that are sort of free from highways and roads. Are we going to have places that are free from technology? How will we push back? Will there be ways to guarantee that there's actually no electronics operational in a certain range? And of course, there's this sort of absurdity to it, but it's actually functional and sort of you have to kind of address it. Similarly, some projects around looking at biological kinds of warfare and manufacturing. This is a project at Ars Electronica a number of years called Dispersion, which was a pathogen vending machine, which sort of prompted you to have a very playful experience because it was visceral and engaging, but then this sort of moral dilemma when things fell out at the bottom and you weren't sure what to do with those and how to handle those, and you have to operate it through a fingerprint recognition. We knew who you were. It was this kind of very kind of ethical dilemma. And then a number of other projects. I'm not going to really go into these, but I think I want to come back to another quote about the kind of art critique here. So I like art because I think art throws off the covers that hide the expressiveness of experienced things. It quickens us from the slackness of routine and enables us to forget ourselves by finding ourselves in the delight of experiencing the world about us in its varied qualities and forms. And I think that I like that because it's sort of this idea that often by taking another viewpoint, you open up some new framing to a problem. And you don't even have to really do this as an art practice, even as an engineer, as a designer, to look at something very differently is a big part of this way to innovate. There's a little bit of a shift here, but I want to make a point about actually engineering and how difficult it is and how difficult the job of even designing novel kinds of experiences. So this was actually a quote from an individual that helped design the lunar lander for the moon. It says, if a major project is truly innovative, you cannot possibly know its exact cost and its exact schedule at the beginning. And in fact, if you do know the exact cost and exact schedule, chances are that the technology is obsolete. So I think, and this probably resonates with the PhD students who are like, when is it going to be done? Like, how far do I have to go? But it's hard. You have to pick something. You have to do something that's kind of, you can't even fully describe. This is the huge challenge that I think a lot of us face. I was thinking back recently about the props that Scott had mentioned, and it is true that it was 2000 or so when Terry invited me here, and I don't know why he agreed to this, but I said, do you use this prop rather than having me up here? And it worked out, so it was this really great moment. But when that was envisioned, this is what was on my desk. Okay, just to give you an idea. I had this really cool, kick-ass Pentium. I was using Mosaic. I had Alta Vista fired up, good to go. And the social network at the time, maybe the Well or Usenet, that's about what you probably had. And my advisor was really cool, so he bought me this Palm Pilot. So I was this mobile. I was just really cool. And it's hard to envision what the future will be. Now it seems very obvious. If this was sitting in front of you, it was very hard to say, yeah, that's it. That was a really big leap at the time. And of course, there's a lot of these now, lots of different products that resemble this. Someone just recently sent me this cool little family tree. And then I actually found you end up never looking at your thesis. I went and looked at my thesis. These are pictures from it. And then here's pictures from this year from some advertising from these companies that you'll hang out in factories and hang out with your friends. You'll use a tablet to control it. We had that. So it was about 17 years out, but we kind of had that vision. But that was very hard to come up with. And in fact, now there's so many of these, but that's the exciting part of this. It seems like the playing field is so level now that lots of people can participate and innovate. And I really want to say something about this idea of the rise of the expert amateur, these makers and builders. I'm very interested in this kind of framing. I already told you about the Solar Center. This is a PCR device for actually replicating DNA. This is the kind of concept toy maker for kids. My own son just recently said, Dad, does Santa have a 3D printer? So this is the next generation. This is how they think. But it's from proprietary innovation to populist innovation. It's not to say that the academy and industry will not be part of this. We'll just play very different roles, but very important roles. So it's kind of trying to understand what that is. And I think part of it is being able to kind of really disrupt things and be playful with them. So I had this manifesto, but I pulled out one quote from it. We want our technologies to sing of not just productivity, but the love of curiosity, the joy of wonderment, and the freshness of the unknown. And it's not to say that we don't want technologies that actually help us solve problems. I mean, I want to get to the Caltrain on time. I want to find some cool restaurants when I'm in an unfamiliar town. But I also want my technologies to prompt me to be curious and reflect and engage in different ways. And I think a big part of it from an educational standpoint is we really need people to envision lots of ideas and ideation. I like this quote from a designer at Frog. Innovation companies today don't ask and don't care about basic skills and grades or SAT scores. Instead, they want to know if you can brainstorm all the possible uses of bubble wrap, right? And it's almost this value of creativity, right? So less grades and GREs, more what's your GitHub profile, what's your Instructable setup look like, what's your Kickstarter profile, right? These kind of different ways of looking at things. But as an educator, I feel that I really sort of, this other statement resonates with me. If it were possible to define generally the mission of education, it could be said that its fundamental purpose is to ensure that all students benefit from learning in ways that allow them to participate fully in public, community, creative, and economic life. So it's a really sort of tall order to figure out. It's not just these sort of fundamentals, but a really deeper engagement. And a little bit more provocative here, in the three ecologies, he talks about, in order to converge with the perspective of the art world, scientists must demonstrate that they have abandoned their white lab coats, beginning with those invisible ones that they wear in their heads, in their language, and in the ways they conduct themselves. So partially it's trying to find a playing field where it's sort of we can all kind of operationalize the things we do. So now I'm going to try to focus more on a couple other example projects that I've done with some students. So I run this Living Environments lab, which looks at this kind of critical intersection between people, technology, and the environment, or the planet in some sense. And I'm not going to talk about all of these. These are some kind of high-level themes, but they do fit into these kind of three ecologies. These are my sort of primary instigators. These are the graduate students that have worked with me most recently: Stacy Kuznetsov, James Pierce, and Sun Young Kim, who are kind of largely responsible for almost all of the really cool content that I show you. I'll try to point that out. So the one thing I do want that I'm really interested in is citizen science, and I do want to talk a little bit more about that. And we have these, this is kind of one of those canonical examples of a Christmas bird watch, people going out and watching birds. And while a lot of people feel, I couldn't really do that, I don't know what they're talking about identifying birds, it ends up that even amateurs, and this is very much an example of sort of crowdsourcing, that it ends up creating great sort of long-term bird population data. But the other thing I like about citizen science is it almost touches back and harkens to early childhood about counting things in your yard and observing the world in unique and interesting ways, being curious, learning, and reflecting. And I think the other opportunities to look at how, of course, technologies have accelerated this idea of of citizen science. So the mobile phone is at least one of many sites that we can use to kind of investigate how to look at the world, because the phone is, no longer a communication tool, right? It's a sort of supercomputer radio station with sensors. Okay, I can't possibly list all of the related projects, but just in sort of broad strokes again, a lot of them are about having people crowdsource and collect information and analyze it, things around environmental issues, but also things around discovering and categorizing galaxies and invasive plants, things like that. So I'll give you a couple examples of some projects we did with a little bit more detail. So one was a project we did early on in Ghana, in Africa. This was allowing taxi cab drivers to go around and collect data using sensors. Not this sensor, the iPhone did not even exist when we did this project. That's a separate one just for visual. Sorry, that's on the same slide. But they collected data about carbon monoxide and a bunch of other chemicals. The red dots show where data was collected. The interesting thing is we wanted to just figure out, would the maps look different? Would people actually get nuances around where air quality varied throughout the day? And it was kind of just to gather some pictures so that we could sort of have ground truth about what data would look like collected by citizens. Kind of the more interesting thing, because we got the graphs and we could look at all the pictures, the more interesting thing was that when people brought these back, they started telling these stories about, oh yeah, the numbers were really high, so I took the ring road into town. Oh, I was really worried my car was a polluter, so I brought mine in to have it looked at. So in fact, it was these stories that we gave people this small lens, and remember, it wasn't even designed to give them any information. That was not part of the study. But they looked at the number nonetheless, and it got them to kind of have a behavior change. And I kind of call that sort of like this Prius effect, right? So when you're driving behind someone, they're trying to get to that 100 mile per gallon, I can get there. You're like, just get there so I can go around you. But anyway, when people have that visual, then it starts to play, they start to sort of have a legibility about it and interact with it and use it. Now, of course, we're interested in how mobile devices play a role in changing behavior and allowing you to do citizen science, but we also looked at indoor kind of fixed monitoring. So this was the same way you could imagine, what if instead of looking at your friend's online status, you could look at all of your friends' indoor air quality in their homes. So that was part of this study that Sun Young did. And again, really interesting because people suddenly observed how their friends were behaving, and they would call them what happened. They're like, yeah, I burnt the dinner. It's like they could sort of see what was happening. But people learned about when they opened their doors or vacuumed or did different activities, how it influenced the air quality. And again, not part of the study, but there were some individuals that actually quit smoking as a result because theirs was so off the chart, and they didn't understand. They thought, wow, I thought it was just a little bit higher, but it was much different. I'll say a little bit more about the mobile and the public place in the following. So another study that I did with Allison Woodruff and Paul Aoki and others was to actually say, well, what if we put sensing onto the infrastructure? So the city of San Francisco, they let us put some sensors onto municipal street sweepers. There's some reasons why that's a bad choice, but there's also reasons why that's a good choice. And that's the setup you can see. The good part of that is street sweepers with about only a half dozen or maybe even a dozen street sweepers, you can cover the whole city every couple days because they go down every single street. The hidden application was that I could have told you right when to move your car when the street sweeper was coming. We didn't really build that app, but I did have that in mind. But you get these kind of visualizations and people looking at the city and looking at how data is collected. People often want to know, where are the bad parts, and some of it's somewhat expected, things around, say, Hunters Point or higher concentration than other areas. And I'm not going to go into sort of all the details of the study, but to point out that I think the solution moving forward is going to be certainly the infrastructure participating with people and other kinds of communities. So speaking of communities, Stacy Kuznetsov looked at exactly that problem of what happens if we give people in different communities these sensors. So we gave some to bicyclists, to a homeless community, to some parents, to some activists. And this is in Pittsburgh, but they moved these around really differently. And it's probably what you would expect, but it was nice to see these results that people want to tell different stories about their city. They want to tell different things about their community. And so collecting the data, and they were able to move these around and put them up wherever they wanted, was a big part of understanding how they would negotiate as a collective what they wanted to do and what kind of narrative they wanted to tell. The other thing which I knew was going to happen was that anything that looks, as excited as we are about having sort of ubiquitous computing be in the future, if it doesn't look like a mobile phone, it's a bomb. So tons of calls from the police department, confiscations. And admittedly, these are very kind of odd looking, so I'll give you that, and I kind of knew that was going to happen. But it brings the question, do we want to have these kind of sensing technologies be very legible and read? Should it be like a metal box with a flashing light, or does it look like a sort of lost teddy bear in the sort of city, or is it hidden? Should it be visible? It's this interesting question that we're trying to look at. We also looked at how you might experience these data sets. So of course things with maps and mobile phones, but maybe there's new kinds of signage in cities to prompt you about the cleanest direction rather than the shortest direction through a city. This is a project that Sun Young Kim did where she looked at actually embedding it into clothing. So now you actually have a shirt that has a measurement device, and then it responds to the air quality and some other playful designs. The thing about the t-shirt, just to point out, was that this was interesting because now, before, I might participate by having some mobile application, I download it and I use it, but in the future, or sorry, in the T-shirt case, imagine you'd walk into a bar and your friends would say, "What is that?" Like, go outside. No, why is it higher out there? Come in here. Wait, go in the bathroom. Wait, go. Okay, get in my car. See what? Okay. So the person becomes this kind of proactive dialogue about the issue rather than just buried in a kind of mobile application. And we looked at how there'd be new ways of kind of almost doing graffiti. This was a project Stacy did where these were robots that were magnetic. You would kind of throw them up like throwies, but then they had motors and they would climb up walls and buildings and take measurements and do things, and you could kind of bang on the wall and they'd come down. And we also looked at sort of how low cost could you make these, and these are just different designs exploring a lot of different parts of the technical elements down to about $15, $20. But I kind of got interested in this idea of what we're calling spectacle computing. So often, of course, we want computing to be very transparent, to disappear in the background, the common vision and ubiquitous computing. But what about these strategies where you intentionally and overtly want to draw attention to a particular issue? So these were, again, air quality balloons. They lit up based on different kinds of pollutants that they measured in the air. And the idea was that people would see these balloons, they'd come up, they'd say, "What's going on?" We would hand one to them, and then all of a sudden now they're part of the sensing infrastructure. They start walking around, their friends ask what it is, they say, "I'm bringing it to my house to check things, I'm going to bring it over to my kid's school, I wonder what's happened in this park." And it creates this very different kind of model of how people can participate in this dialogue about sensing. That's very different structure than standard sort of sensing on a phone or something like that. But we actually question even what a sensor is, and I think it's a separate issue. We could say, what is a sensor? You know, there's a certain idea about what that might look like, but we said, well, even if you look around, there's lots of things that have kind of nothing to do with technology. Plants, the way bees behave, the way fish behave, that tell you a lot if you know how to read them. And we interviewed a bunch of people who did this, who used technology, or they were not Luddites, but could easily read into the environment what was happening. We got very interested in these kind of biomarkers, or ways that, kind of new ways of seeing, I would say. So Stacy primarily looked at this, but the idea was that rather than always looking down on your device to look at information, what if there were also prompts to look around, get a sort of some overview, and then also in a hybrid approach, use the technology. And she's gone on and done some more work in this biosensing with more community engagement. These are sort of various columns that actually measure lead in various soil samples. And there's a digital element and there's a biological element. And we're really interested in how to design that kind of interface and interconnects between them to create compelling experiences. All right, so I want to come back to this idea I alluded to before of micro-volunteerism. So this is like I think this is a little more broad than citizen science. So you might imagine volunteering for, you might go to a weekend beach cleanup. You might volunteer for a couple weekends for Habitat for Humanity. You may enlist in the military or the Peace Corps for multiple years, or go away to teach abroad. These are different models of volunteering. But what does it mean when, I'm on the corner of, Main and 3rd and I have 47 seconds? I'll volunteer 47 seconds. And it's a lot of actually problems that people are looking at. Michael's looking at this, and I know a lot of people are, of how can you actually take advantage of this cognitive surplus, as Clay Shirky calls it. I actually love this quote that just got pulled out from Obama the other night. "The role of citizen in our democracy does not end with your vote." So in some sense, it's obviously a call of further participation in different ways. I think that fits in well to these models of how we can engage people in sensing and other kinds of strategies. So here's your sort of typical sort of citizen science project, right? Here's Susan. She sees this invasive beetle on the plant. So she goes, uh-oh, takes the picture. She uploads it. And the sort of scientist or sort of policymaker gets it. They get a bunch of information. They sort of crowdsource this. They make some collective action. And they solve the problem in some end game. So the interesting thing is when we do these projects, and we've done a couple of them, people go, "Hey, that was cool, whatever the thing you did about the beetles. I don't care about beetles. I care about idling buses," or "I care about some other issue." So for a while, we were doing all these various instantiations of citizen science projects, but we got more interested in, allowing people to kind of make their own. So the idea, and others are looking at this too, but how could Susan say, I want to compose my own campaign, and I want people to, whatever, take a picture or have a comment field. And this is similar to a lot of work where people are doing kind of remote sort of collection of forms and things. Even actually the butterfly stuff that Scott did a number of years ago is in this same genre of looking at how people can actually compose in a sort of non-programmatic way the kinds of things they want to capture and report. It's also how they can kind of manage it in real time, so how they can sort of see the different people coming in, and how there's almost a subscription model. So I might be in Stanford for a couple of days, and I would say, I wonder if there's any interesting campaigns I would want to be a part of, and I could subscribe to them and say, oh great, I'll be parts of those. And maybe they pertain to me because as a parent I care about them, or maybe as a Californian I care about them, or some other issue. The other thing, and this is where there's more expertise here to look at this, but this idea of how people will debate and sort of essentially make decisions about the data. And I think actually a lot of work that Jeff's been looking at and some of his students about how do you visualize these data sets, how do you make action on them based on different ways of viewing them and sort of interacting with them. So let me posit a couple open areas of exploration I think are interesting in this citizen science from our experience. One is that there needs to be more sensor flexibility in terms of context. So I showed you some examples around air quality. We talked about beetles and other things, but maybe you're in the Central Valley of California, it's really about pesticides. So there should be some way to very flexibly exchange these kinds of sensing sensors and apps in some sense. Another one is looking at not just the citizen science from sensing, but the analysis. So this is a picture from outside of Pittsburgh where there's a lot of Marcellus shale drilling, and there's a lot of runoff and sort of pollutions around this. But the issue is, I might not be near this in California to really take pictures and help be involved, but maybe it concerns me. But I could participate in terms of analyzing the data, much like the things that are on some of the other projects I showed before from other individuals looking at sort of analyzing data. And again, Michael's done a lot of this as well. Another thing that seems to be really vital is foregrounding contribution. So having people actually know that their data made a difference. Your data was downloaded by the EPA. We changed that bus route by your house based on some reports. Just letting people know that the data is being used and active. What the story, when I tell it, people go, this is great, I would love to participate, and I believe them, but I just don't think they're really going to do it in week 72. I think it's just going to be a burden, right? So I'm really interested in these longer term studies. Can't ignore badges, right? If someone would have told me little 25 by 25 pixel icons really mattered, I would have probably dismissed it many years ago. But people love these rewards and badges. And in fact, you can imagine re-looking at this not from the sense of being a mayor of a space, but maybe being the citizen scientist of a place, unlocking a microclimate by collecting enough information or enough data. Being the kind of citizen scientist of a lake or stream, or unlocking the rivers and streams badge. And I think games and play are going to be a big part of this because a lot of the sort of front end of the systems we design look very sort of scientific still, and I think there can be playful ways to have them more as games. So something where individuals, instead of looking at, imagine a game where, say, bumblebees were some kind of game element, and you knew where the bumblebees were to get points or something like that. But in fact, that was really just pollen measurements around your city. So you would already sort of be indirectly learning about pollen and pollen density and seasons. But maybe you say, I want to create my own bumblebees. So then you start measuring the pollen counts and put your own bumblebees into the game. Something like that where you're kind of can scaffold up into different involvement. And maybe you're happy with that, but maybe you actually scaffold up into sort of a more a role where you're kind of running the game or running the campaign. And finally, this idea of what a sensor is, I just think somehow we're thinking really narrowly about it. I mean, it could be, why don't sort of children's, dump trucks and diggers have soil sensors on them? And dogs, and I already told you about some of the other projects here, but it's not to say that they should be scientific and frightening and scary, but children, obviously, as they learn, they should think that objects will help them be smart and kind of reflect about the environment in just very playful ways. And I just sort of posit that. I don't have any sort of final designs, but I think there's huge opportunities in moving away from things that look like strange probes that people are holding out and taking measurements. Okay, last project I want to talk to you about is about energy. And this is some work with James Pierce, who's been largely leading this effort. And the idea is that certainly right now, electricity, for example, you plug into the wall and it's pretty uniform and it works and it functions, and that's a good thing. But could we think about it in a different way? So I'll give you an overly sappy example with my now not in Halloween costume son. So imagine he goes out and he's swinging during the day, but he generates a little bit of electricity, just a little bit. And he brings that home to me. And then that night, you sort of read from the light generated from that. So is that different than just plugging into the wall? That's the question. So I would claim it is. I mean, it was handcrafted. It's a gift. It has emotional value. It's very sentimental. And in some sense, it's exactly what Walter Benjamin talks about with the aura of objects. And he talks about it more in art framing, but it's the same thing. The authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from its substantive duration to its testimony to the history which it has experienced. And I'll come back to that in a second, because right now we just really plug in and kind of forget about it. What if we knew more about where the energy came from? So is it fresh? Is it stale? Is it hydroelectric? Was it generated somehow far away or nearby? Right now, when most of the time we talk about energy and sort of problem solving, we talk about, well, we're consuming too much energy. We need to figure out ways to reduce the consumption. And that's extremely useful. But at least when James and I look at this, we say, well, actually, there's these other things. What about how people could collect energy? What about how they share things? What about how they could keep it? Those are other opportunities for people to have some kind of experience with energy, and there might be design opportunities in that landscape too. It's not to say this is the wrong one, but I think there's more missed opportunity. So, and people do this now, right? So some people, more sophisticated, they have energy they're producing, and they just put it back in the grid, right? But you can imagine other policies, sort of, I'm collecting this energy, but I want to share with other people in my block. I want to share with other people that have dogs. I want to share with other people who are at a different sort of economic status than me, or whatever. There could be different policies. Right now, we don't really relate to it in that way. I mean, you could almost think about computer science terms, which everybody's probably familiar with here, and saying, well, what would energy metadata about where it came from? What would that look like? What would kind of social issues around energy, and you shared it, does it have the same kind of textural qualities? Could you crowdsource energy and do things? Actually, an interesting thing is when we're looking at the work from the Weiser's vision with the pad tab board, it ends up there's these very distinct ways to actually harvest energy that are exactly at that scale, sort of finger-like, arm-like, and body-like. So it's a really nice kind of mapping that we looked at in terms of kind of 110, 100 watts that you can kind of get at. These are a couple other design prompts. So one of them is a seasonal energy lamp that just says, essentially, could you look at the kinds of energy that's available? So is it sunny out, or is there kind of a lot of hydroelectric now? So you have some reflection about it. You could think of it this way, where right now, would you get off the bus and say, I'm going to leave a couple joules here behind for my bus riders with me? Would you exchange energy in this fluid way? We don't even really see it visibly, right? So we don't have these kinds of interfaces, and it's sort of strange because it seems as if this would be really informative about, you'd go to Iceland and pick up some really unusual energy. Maybe you want to save it because it has special kinds of qualities to it. And when you think about, we did some studies just looking at how people interact with these devices, and in fact, people largely, even though they do the same thing, everybody consistently feels these are more genuine. These are more sort of with the material. They're sort of provide this handcraftedness to them. And we've looked at how you could actually design these mementos in some sense that are these singular emotional bits of energy. So things that you could actually save up and exchange small bits of energy. Another sort of sappy example, but it gets the point, would you and say your father turn a hand crank together? Would you take that and put it on the shelf with your other heirlooms? Is that something that you value? And I'm not saying that lots of like little bits of energy does not an energy crisis solve. But different and novel engagements with energy can lead to new thinking about other problem solving in this space that right now is largely a grid that we don't really have interface or access with. And this is just some of the sort of technologies we built to do this. And this is the last piece I want to talk about, which is just another energy project. This is an art piece at Ars Electronica that I did this year on energy parasites. So the idea here is that, well, there's places where energy is sort of seeping out of the environment. Can we kind of harvest it or almost steal it from different places and reuse it and repurpose it in different ways? So, could you put it onto a tram or a BART, or it would run through and you'd have this wind energy, and now you'd say, well, I charge my phone to this wind energy. I'm going to call my friend with the wind energy from BART, or I'm going to bring back some subway energy from another city. Or we did a lot of different variations of this, right? So would it be things with a gutter where the water would be flowing, or it could be something on a handrail where we put it into sort of different stores here around the Bay Area in Europe, where you could actually sort of harvest it off of handrails, and you could put a water fountain. There it is on the handrail. The one down here is actually you stick onto a car, it steals a little bit of electricity off someone's headlight, then you grab it off later and you charge your phone or something with it. But it's showing how you can repurpose and reuse energy that we don't think about, we don't see viscerally that kind of small elements. None of this is solving sort of some energy crisis, and this is technically slowing down the train. You're not getting anything for free, right? But it's prompting you to think about opportunities for engagement. So with that, I just want to thank my students again, and the National Science Foundation, the Heinz, for supporting the work financially, and thank you for having me back here. This is one of my favorite venues, so thank you again. So it also should say, I'm looking for students. So, because I just arrived at Berkeley. So you get to stay in the Bay Area. I know I'm not supposed to steal Stanford students, but I'm on the PR push.
We try to encourage our undergraduates to go somewhere else for their graduate degrees. So.
Perfect. Okay. I don't think they're going to get in trouble here or something. Michael.
It has some interesting connections with things like seed bombing, where like within an urban environment, you give people natural wildflowers, and you're just supposed to toss them in holes in the ground so that you have the small beautification of the area. Almost makes me wonder whether what you're sort of doing is, or trying to get at, is sensorable. And get everyone to sort of leave little bits of sensors or little actuators around that everyone can make use of or actually tap into. Is that sort of the goal you're trying to push toward, or do you see something different?
Well, sort of. I mean, certainly one thing, so seed bombing is great. I love that kind of analogy. We've thought about if you had, that was a little bit about the work Stacy did with these sensors. They're a little bit, we did a smaller version of that where we gave people somewhat non-functional versions so they could be smaller, just to see what the design issues were. But would people scatter them around? Because then it was really cheap for us to make them. And then all these weird prompts about, people did this. They literally put on a toilet seat. They put it on like, I don't want to sit in this chair. There's something weird there. I want to sense what's there. But it's not only what you are saying about the place by putting them there, but then also about when I see those, it's telling me like your reflections about it. So I love that it's clearly provocative, because you could imagine all of a sudden you come out of your yard and there's all these sensors. Like, what are my neighbors like worrying I'm like leaking oil here? What's going on? And I'm also concerned that everything's about environmental issues. I mean, I'm guilty of that with our own projects, but I'd like to have it feel where, yeah, it could be just playful. Like, I just want to count, skateboarders that go by here. It's just something fun and playful, because I think that will engage people in thinking about how the tools, I think when people think about problem solving, they'll think very much what a lot of the stuff you're doing too, that you'll say, oh, I will send out this kind of call to arms and people will respond. And that's part of how I'll answer big questions about anything from, the big issues we get at, but also little things. I want it to feel very fluid for them to do these kinds of issues. Yeah. There's interesting, I'm convinced any good technology has bad sides to it, and there's clearly a lot of bad things in here. It's the whole I can report bad data and drive down your real estate in your neighborhood. Also, the Marcellus Shale thing, actually, a lot of groups we're working with don't want to really work with that because it's telling the gas industry where they're actually watching them. They would rather not have them know where they're watching them. So it creates these kind of problems. I don't know, a lot of issues. Scott.
I was interested how a number of your research projects make people more aware of a resource than they otherwise would be. I think we've all had the experience of, like, you're camping and you have a very limited amount of fuel, and so you become much more attentive to how you use your fuel. Or money, by virtue of being, in the case of quarters and dollars, physical. I worry much, if I dropped a dime behind the couch, I would probably go ferret it out. And there are other resources that are much less physically represented that I would waste an equivalent amount of without even worrying about. So one thing that I was interested in is the way that a number of your recent projects sort of take something which otherwise wouldn't be in your attentional foreground and put it there. And whether that kind of presentness has effects beyond just that energy, but to all energy or other kinds of experiences.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Actually, I think so. At least with energy, I think this actually is true for almost all the projects. Certainly, the kind of more environmental ones, where current strategies are. A lot of them are about kind of guilting you out. Really, it's about sort of you should be saving more. You could save 10 cents here. There's this, you're increasing the ozone layer, all these kind of issues. Whereas our strategy has been, let's just give people a different lens to see something with no sort of part of the design prompting them one way or the other. And often they'll, just with this new information, they'll reflect on and take some action. There could be bad strategy with that, but certainly when people see things like the air quality, we saw, we didn't tell people what to do with it. We didn't create these kind of ominous interfaces that sort of screamed at you and told you about, flee the room. And similar with the energy, it was less about you need to save energy. It was just, let me just give you a little bit more lens of what's happening. You figure it out, which is, it's kind of an art approach, really, to sort of not present a full narrative, right? Yeah, I don't know if that answers that, but it's certainly the strategy that I'm more interested in. It may be less successful. I'm completely open to admitting that. I just feel from a design landscape, there's a lot of stuff going on in the other area, so I'd like to create dialogue in the other side of that. I think the right solution is all these is probably this hybrid thing. Yes, you'd like to have things prompt you, turn this off, change something here. But I also worry they could be really disruptive, and might really, you turn these things off if they're not kind of immediately a little bit playful and engaging. That said, there's a problem because we did one, I didn't talk about it, we did a project Sun Young did on, or actually Stacy did on water conservation. We put these into bathrooms and public places, and it let you kind of visualize water use, and you kind of compare to other people that use it, and we tried out different interfaces. Part of a study that we published, but the problem was it was too playful, people wasted water playing around with it. So yeah, cautionary tale, these things go both ways. So it's a fair critique. Yes.
In my work, I'm looking into how to use crowdsourcing in policymaking, like for instance in law reforms, constitution reforms and such. Have you seen any examples of integrating gamification into policymaking and that kind of complicated and complex wealth of information that people are trying to produce?
Okay, yeah, so the question was around policy making with crowdsourcing, basically. Yeah, I think, well, a little bit of a sort of plug. There's a project at Berkeley, this Data and Democracy project, which is about how people can create policies and look at essentially their voting issues and other people's, and kind of you can essentially get multiple people to weigh in about their beliefs, and you actually, what kind of comes out is often you're more aligned with people than you think. You think that it's sort of, I can't possibly share the same views as, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, but then you go, actually, a couple things, that's rather surprising. And I think some things that we've thought about are, right now we just had an election, it's on everyone's mind, we had all these things go on, and we're always like, oh, how do you feel about this policy, and that's how I'm voting. But that sort of fades, right? So could there be technologies to keep an awareness about you know, it was a little bit more of a thought back when I was in Pittsburgh, but like, oh, they just plowed my street with the snow. That was because this person got elected and they voted at the meeting, and just some way of connecting me to a liveness of politics in some way. That's not exactly, I think, what you're asking, but in some sense, I think sharing these ideas and coming to like solutions, it's gonna. I mean, there's you know, data.gov. There's all these projects around. Even the Code for America folks are doing a lot of things in the same space. So I'm not really probably the right person to ask. There's many, and I'm probably not speaking correctly to all of them. But I think there are. That's a very exciting topic. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Please.
The degree to in policy would be the degree to which you could integrate many of the wonderful sensors that you're talking about into larger patterns or larger inferences about behavior or what could happen, what is happening. Have you thought about that aspect of this?
Well, would you like, when I described the sort of the project, we're actually building that, the one that's kind of about citizen science, the way people form their own campaigns and things. But the issue is, could you have something where you almost belong to these sort of cohorts or tribes, and you sort of, and it would be prompted, so it's, I don't know, maybe not in Palo Alto that often, I decided to take a walk down here, and then it says, hey, we're missing some data from this area, could you take some measurements? We're trying to make a decision about something. Or we have some really strange data in this place, could you take some data here? Or maybe there's some reward structure where if you are out getting coffee, we need you to take 4 pictures of something along the way. So these kind of just-in-time prompts, or also like keeping people on reserve, which is a lot of strategies that have been really successful that Michael's looked at and others of. I think that that's a better solution where it's not constantly in the foreground, but you feel involved enough that you're kind of called to arms in some sense for these brief instances. I'm back to this micro-volunteerism. I think as all these HCI and design projects, it's where's the sweet spot? Because too little engagement and then I've forgotten about it. Too much engagement and now it's annoying, I don't want to be part of that. And I don't know what the answer is, but we will do what we always do. We will experiment and we will celebrate and commiserate, and then we'll convene again and figure out what's going on. But it's good to have that. I like having that dialogue now because I can tell that's the future I want to live in. I just don't know how to dial it in right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you all for letting me come here.